On February 2, 1943, amid the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the once mighty German Sixth Army surrendered to the Red Army. It was one of World War II's most dramatic turning points. Around 91,000 German soldiers laid down their arms that day, but only a fraction ever returned. Deported deep into the Soviet Union, many were never identified, never recorded, and never seen again. Their families received no graves, no letters, only silence. In time, thousands of names vanished from military and civil records alike, as if erased from history. What happened to them? How could an entire army vanish behind the Iron Curtain? Stalingrad's trap, the turning point of a crumbling empire. Stalingrad didn't fall in one day. It froze, crumbled, and starved to death. By the time the German Sixth Army surrendered, the city looked like a dead planet. Streets disappeared under rubble. Water pipes froze and burst. Fires from constant shelling melted the snow, only for it to freeze again into jagged ice. German soldiers lived in basements or half-collapsed buildings with no heat or light. Temperatures dropped as low as -35 degrees. Frostbite turned fingers black. Some men were found with their boots frozen to their feet. To survive, soldiers used curtains, tablecloths, even wallpaper for warmth. They tore fabric from the bodies of fallen comrades. Hunger made them eat horse meat, dead dogs, boiled leather, and sometimes even sawdust mixed with water. The trap closed in November 1942. On the morning of November 19th, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. It wasn't aimed at the center of the German line. It hit the edges. Those flanks were guarded by Romania's Third Army and Hungary's Second Army. These units had little artillery, few anti-tank weapons, and poor winter clothing. In just 3 days, the Soviets, using 1.1 million men, 13,000 artillery guns, and over 1,000 tanks, closed the ring. By November 23rd, Soviet forces from the north and south met in the town of Gulag, cutting off over 250,000 Axis troops. Inside the pocket, German General Friedrich Paulus commanded the Sixth Army. He had been a staff officer before the war, known for his precise planning, but not for boldness. When he realized the scale of the encirclement, he asked Hitler for permission to break out westward and link up with General Manstein's relief force, but Hitler, speaking from his headquarters in East Prussia, refused. "The Sixth Army will stand fast," he ordered. "Capitulation is out of the question." Hitler believed the Luftwaffe could supply the army from the air, delivering 300 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition each day. In practice, the Luftwaffe could deliver only 80 tons on a good day. Some days, bad weather and Soviet fighters kept planes grounded. Between November and January, of the 500 aircraft committed to the operation, over 200 were lost. The main airfield, Pitomnik, was shelled constantly. A transport plane landed every few hours, sometimes right onto a frozen corpse-strewn runway, and unloaded whatever it could before flying back, empty. As the Soviet circle tightened, even these flights stopped. Inside the encirclement, desperation became routine. A field surgeon, Dr. Hans Doscher, wrote about amputating limbs with no anesthesia using kitchen knives. Men died in corners of bunkers, covered in lice. Typhus, dysentery, and frostbite spread quickly. Soviet propaganda leaflets fell from the sky, urging surrender. One leaflet read, "No German soldier will return home from Stalingrad. Save your life. Cross the lines." Many believed it. By January 1943, the German position had collapsed. General Paulus had lost communication with Berlin. Soviet troops stormed key positions, house by house. On January 26th, the encirclement was split in two when Soviet tanks reached the banks of the Volga near the Barricadi factory. The Sixth Army was now divided and isolated. Paulus was trapped in the southern pocket, headquartered beneath the Univermag department store. On January 30th, Hitler promoted him to field marshal. The message was clear: no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus reportedly said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." On the morning of January 31st, Soviet troops entered the basement and found Paulus sitting quietly. Without ceremony, he surrendered. He refused to give an official statement, but later told Soviet officers, "I could not justify continuing the slaughter." His surrender marked the end of organized resistance in the South. Over the next 2 days, isolated groups in the North followed. On February 2nd, General Karl Strecker surrendered the last group of 11,000 starving troops near the Traktorny factory. Of the roughly 91,000 men who surrendered, including 24 generals, only about 5,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return home years later. For Hitler, it was a catastrophe. For the Soviet Union, it was a victory unlike any before. And for the German soldiers left behind in the snow, it was the start of a nightmare. Dragged through the snow, the death marches to nowhere. After the surrender, the real suffering began. Around 91,000 Axis soldiers, mostly Germans, but also Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, and Croatians, were rounded up by the Red Army and forced to march through deep snow to transit camps like Beketovka and Beli Ovrag. Many had no boots. Some tied cardboard or rags around their feet. Others wrapped newspaper or straw to fight off the frostbite. Temperatures often dropped below -25°C. Snow reached their knees. Wind cut through whatever clothing they still had. Many were injured, some with makeshift slings, others dragging limbs behind them. There were no wagons, no blankets, no hot food. The men survived on what they could find: snow, crusts of bread, frozen scraps of horse meat. Many were already weak from starvation. Out in the open, their bodies started to fail. Those who collapsed were left behind. Some were beaten for slowing down. Others were shot. Prisoners later said the guards varied. Some were brutal, others indifferent, and rare ones showed brief kindness. A warm drink, a crust of bread, a few German words stood out in memory. The marches wound through shattered villages and frozen steppe. Civilians lined the paths. Many had lived under Axis occupation. They had watched their towns burn and families die. Now they hurled rocks. They spat. Some swore in Russian or Ukrainian. A few offered food, but risked punishment from guards. One German lieutenant, Wilhelm Lottmann, wrote later, "We were not men to them. We were the ruins of an army. They looked at us like ghosts walking to their graves." When the survivors finally reached transit camps, the nightmare didn't end. The camps were overcrowded, unheated, and filthy. In Beli Ovrag, prisoners were jammed into wooden huts without beds. There was no soap, no medical care, and no proper latrines. Lice spread rapidly. The water came from melted snow or ice when available. Dysentery and typhus swept through the barracks. One Red Army report from early February 1943 described up to 30 deaths per day in a single compound. Corpses were stacked outside the barracks, or buried in shallow pits when the ground was soft enough to dig. Rations were minimal. Some prisoners received a ladle of watery soup and a chunk of bread each day. Others got nothing for days at a time. Guards often stole food meant for the captives. In some cases, those with connections or useful skills, like doctors or interpreters, were treated slightly better. But for the ordinary soldier, hunger was constant. People fought over crumbs. Some ate shoe leather or candle wax. Gangrene was common. Without treatment, frostbitten toes and fingers turned black. Amputations were often done with pocket knives or saws without morphine. Not all the violence came from nature. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, conducted investigations inside the camps. Any sign of resistance or sabotage was met with swift punishment. In one documented case, 127 German prisoners were executed in a mass shooting near Beketovka after being accused of refusing orders. Whether the charges were true remains unclear. There were no trials. Orders were carried out in silence. Those who survived described the shooting site, a clearing behind the barracks, marked only by boot prints in the snow and blood that quickly froze. Frozen captives inside Stalin's labor prisons. Once the prisoners were sorted and moved beyond the transit camps, many ended up scattered across the Soviet Union in labor camps. These weren't extermination camps, but the harsh conditions proved just as deadly. The gulag system sorted men by rank, skill, and health. High-ranking officers were placed in special compounds with heated rooms, libraries, and regular meals. Their value was political. If they could be turned, they could be used to undermine Hitler in propaganda. Skilled workers, doctors, engineers, technicians were spared for labor. An engineer might be ordered to repair machines. A doctor might be forced to operate with kitchen knives and vodka. The rest, tens of thousands of regular soldiers, were used as expendable labor. They worked in quarries, felled trees near Ryazan, built rail lines in the Urals, or cleaned battlefields, digging up frozen bodies and landmines. Some worked barefoot in snow. Soviet records show 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. Rations were tied to output. Faster workers got bread and watery soup. Slower ones got less, even if sick or frostbitten. As men weakened, they worked less, ate less, and slipped into a deadly cycle. Many collapsed where they stood, dragged to the infirmary or buried in the snow. Diseases were everywhere. Beriberi caused swelling and nerve damage. Scurvy made teeth fall out. Malnutrition thinned the blood and made wounds impossible to heal. In some camps, like Suzdal, typhus broke out. In the winter of 1943, the epidemic killed up to 20 or 30 men a night. Bodies were stacked behind barracks or dumped into mass graves carved into the permafrost. Soap was rare. Lice spread unchecked. There were about 600 German doctors among the prisoners. Most of them worked without proper tools. They reused bandages scraped clean of dried blood. They amputated fingers and toes blackened by frostbite, using knives sterilized in boiling water. There was no anesthesia, a stick to bite down on, and a pair of guards to hold the patient still. The doctors wrote journals on scraps of newspaper, hoping one day someone would read what they had seen. One of the worst camps was Sapozhok. In January 1943, the daily mortality rate was as high as 10%. That means 1 in 10 men died every single day. Prisoners there described hearing the death rattle of neighbors every night and waking up beside frozen corpses. Sometimes they buried their friends in the morning before heading off to dig trenches or chop wood. As weeks turned to months, the Soviets began what they called reclassification. Each month, prisoners were inspected. Those judged too weak for labor were marked down and given less food. The logic was brutal. If a man couldn't contribute, he didn't deserve to survive. These inspections meant death for many. Even those who had survived the battle and the marches were now wasting away. The monastery turned mind game when generals switched sides. While thousands of ordinary soldiers were dying in cold camps and nameless forests, a very different scene was playing out inside the stone walls of a monastery. The St. Euthemius Monastery in Suzdal, about 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, had been turned into a holding site for Germany's highest-ranking prisoners from the Battle of Stalingrad. Among them was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the man who had commanded the 6th Army. Alongside him were dozens of generals, staff officers, and aides. These were not starving men dragging themselves through snow. They were living in rooms with beds, heating, and shelves full of books. The Soviets had no intention of letting these men rot. They saw something else in them: useful voices. The NKVD, the Soviet State Security Agency, ran the place like a psychological laboratory. Officers were offered respect, comfort, and slowly exposed to arguments meant to turn them against Hitler. In the monastery's quiet halls, guards handed them newspapers with stories about Germany's destruction. Radios played broadcasts from London and Moscow. They were invited to discussions, debates, lectures. The goal wasn't just to convert them, it was to weaponize them. General Walter von Seydlitz was the first to break. A career officer who had also surrendered at Stalingrad, Seydlitz believed the war was lost, and that continuing to fight only meant more German deaths. In Soviet custody, he proposed forming a committee of officers to publicly denounce the Nazi regime. By July 1943, with NKVD backing, he helped found the National Committee for a Free Germany, or NKFD. The idea was bold: encourage German soldiers to surrender by showing that even their generals had turned. Seydlitz gave speeches, signed declarations, and even recruited other officers into the cause. At first, Field Marshal Paulus refused. He sat silent, angry, ashamed. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal just before the surrender, with the unspoken message, "Die rather than fall into enemy hands." Paulus did not die, and for months he stayed quiet in Soviet hands, watching. Then in 1944, something changed. Perhaps it was news from Germany, Allied bombings, defeats in Normandy. Perhaps it was the growing influence of Seydlitz and others. Whatever the reason, Paulus finally agreed to speak. His first public break came during the Nuremberg trials, when he testified about Hitler's responsibility for launching the war. Before that, in Soviet broadcasts and interviews, he began criticizing the Nazi leadership. This was gold for Soviet propaganda. The Field Marshal of the Sixth Army, once trusted by Hitler, now speaking against him. It was exactly the kind of psychological blow the Soviets wanted to deliver. Paulus never joined the NKFD officially, but his voice carried weight. He recorded messages to German soldiers, urging them to give up the fight. Soviet radio aired them on the front lines. Inside the monastery, life was surprisingly civilized. Officers read Russian literature in translation, attended small theater performances, even debated Marxist ideas in roundtable settings. The Soviets brought in artists and scholars. There were cultural events, concerts, debates for foreign press. Western journalists were shown the monastery, told these men had come to see the truth. It was all staged, but effective. What made it harder to watch was the contrast. While generals dined on warm meals and wore clean uniforms, enlisted men were dying by the thousands in frozen camps. There was no propaganda in those places, only starvation, disease, and silence. The irony was painful. The higher you had stood in Hitler's army, the more useful you became in Soviet hands. The lower you were, the more likely you were to be forgotten. And most were, unearthed after decades, the lost dead of the Volga. When the guns finally went silent over Stalingrad in early 1943, the city lay in ruins, and the earth beneath it was filled with bodies. Soviet troops clearing the battlefield reported corpses frozen mid-motion, still clutching weapons, or collapsed in shattered trenches. With temperatures dropping to -30°C, the dead did not decompose. They simply froze where they fell. There were too many to bury with dignity. Soviet Colonel Andrei Grechko, then a senior officer in the 62nd Army, later said bluntly, "We buried 300 a day, sometimes more. But many were just covered by snow or rubble. Bomb craters became mass graves. So did abandoned trenches and collapsed bunkers. In some cases, bodies were thrown into lime pits to speed up decomposition. Most of the dead were never identified. German soldiers carried small metal identification tags, split in half if they were confirmed dead. But during the chaos, many tags were lost, burned, or stolen. Soviet forces had no resources or incentive to catalog the remains of an enemy that had brought such destruction. Their priority was clearing the city and preventing disease. The names of tens of thousands disappeared into the soil along the Volga. Families in Germany received no information. In many cases, the last letter or photograph sent home became the only record that a man had ever reached Stalingrad. Decades passed before the lost were found again. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, veterans organizations and historical groups began mapping former battlefields. Local volunteers, many from Volgograd itself, started unearthing remains as construction projects and farming uncovered bones, helmets, and rotted uniforms. With better access to old military maps and testimonies, German researchers returned to Russia to assist in locating and preserving war dead. By 2010, technology had become part of the search. Ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging drones began scanning known battlefield zones for disturbed soil patterns that suggested mass graves. One of the most significant discoveries came in 2018, near the Angarsky area west of the city. A dig led by the German War Graves Commission uncovered a pit containing 1,837 German soldiers, most still with fragments of their equipment and winter clothing. These were not clean finds. Many of the dead had shattered skulls, broken limbs, or signs of shrapnel wounds. Some appeared to have died from exposure, curled against each other in shallow shelters. Others were found still wearing their medals or carrying letters, now half erased by soil and time. The discovery at Angarsky was both a historical event and a national trauma revisited. Memorial services were held at the site before reburials began at the Rososhka Cemetery, a dedicated German military cemetery created in 1999 about 37 kilometers from Volgograd. To identify the remains, new science was needed. That's where Project War DNA came in. Launched in cooperation between German and Russian researchers, the initiative uses DNA matching to reconnect bones to families across Europe. In one confirmed case, a molar pulled from a skeleton helped identify Wolfgang Geringer, a private from Bavaria who had been missing since December 1942. His family had never known where he died. The clue came from a dental plate preserved in ice, later cross-checked against medical records from Munich. Project War DNA is slow, expensive, and emotionally complex. Samples have to be collected from living relatives, and many families are hesitant to reopen old wounds. But it has led to hundreds of matches. Still, the scale is overwhelming. An estimated 700,000 Axis soldiers are still missing across the former Soviet Union, many of them from Stalingrad and its surrounding front lines. Some lie beneath modern roads and buildings. Others remain in no man's land, far from memory or marker. Most will likely never be named. The soldiers who came back as strangers. When the war ended in May 1945, the families of Stalingrad's missing still clung to the hope that someone might return. But years passed, and silence stretched into decades. Of the 91,000 men captured after the surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 ever came home. Most of them didn't arrive until the 1950s. The last large group, around 2,000 men, was released from Soviet captivity in 1955 after a deal between West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the Kremlin. By then, many had spent over a decade in labor camps. They came back gaunt, hollow-eyed, with sunken cheeks and bent backs. Some had lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Others limped from untreated injuries or coughed constantly from tuberculosis they had picked up in Siberian prisons. But these returning soldiers were strangers in their own homes. Their wives had often remarried. Children they had last seen as toddlers were now adults who barely remembered them. In one documented case, a man returned to Stuttgart in 1954 only to find his wife had listed him as dead 10 years earlier. His home was gone. She had moved on. Others faced suspicion or even hostility, especially in West Germany, where talk of defeat and captivity was uncomfortable in a country rebuilding itself around pride and recovery. These men had not come back as heroes. They had come back as ghosts. The emotional damage was harder to see, but ran deeper than frostbite or broken bones. Many survivors showed signs of what later came to be called Stalingrad survivor syndrome. Psychologist Alexander Mitscherlich described this condition in the 1960s. It included emotional numbness, sudden outbursts of rage, hoarding of food, and nightmares filled with snow, blood, and endless marching. Some survivors kept bread under their pillows or refused to throw away food, no matter how spoiled. The trauma of starvation had etched itself into their instincts. Memoirs written in the years after the war paint a bleak picture of what these men endured. Ice and Hunger, a diary-style account by a Stalingrad prisoner named Hans Erich Nass, describes how prisoners boiled tree bark for soup and chewed on leather belts to fight off hunger. One chapter recalls men so starved they fought over a dead rat found in a snowbank. There were whispers of cannibalism, though rarely admitted openly. The cold, the marches, the disease, and the endless waiting wore down even the strongest wills. Some men chose to die rather than keep going. Nass wrote, "You walked until your feet turned black, until your friend dropped next to you, and then you kept walking, because stopping meant dying next." When these survivors returned to Germany, they walked into a divided nation. In West Germany, the government offered little recognition. The prevailing attitude was that the past should be buried, so the country could move forward. Many Stalingrad veterans were left without counseling or even a proper welcome. Public ceremonies focused on the fallen, not the returned. In contrast, East Germany treated some of the returnees as symbols of socialist redemption, especially those who had joined the Soviet-backed National Committee for a Free Germany during captivity. These men were showcased in parades and interviews as examples of good Germans who had seen the truth behind Nazism. But even then, the praise came with conditions. Only those who cooperated or took up party roles were celebrated. Others were ignored or suspected of being too loyal to the old regime. Whether in East or West, the men from Stalingrad rarely spoke of what they had seen. The silence stretched across kitchens and workplaces. Some drank to forget, others withdrew from their families. A few, like Paulus himself, lived the rest of their lives in quiet reflection. But many simply faded away. In towns across Germany, you could find old men who stared too long at snow or flinched when hearing the word Volga. They had survived something few could understand, and they carried it until their last breath. Stalingrad's legacy, a graveyard that still breathes. On the high ground overlooking the Volga River stands Mamayev Kurgan, a hill once soaked in fire and blood. During the Battle of Stalingrad, this was one of the most contested points in the city. The hill changed hands dozens of times between the Red Army and German forces from September 1942 to January 1943. Every inch of soil was churned by shellfire and soaked in the bodies of the fallen. Today, the site has become a symbol. At its summit stands The Motherland Calls, a towering statue of a woman with a sword raised toward the sky. Unveiled in 1967, it stands 85 meters tall from base to tip, making it one of the tallest statues in the world. Beneath it lie the remains of roughly 35,000 Soviet soldiers, buried in mass graves beneath the concrete walkways. But Mamayev Kurgan is not the only place where the war dead rest. Just outside Volgograd, at Rososhka, lies another cemetery. Unlike the Soviet graves under the giant monument, this one carries German names on black granite slabs. It was opened in 1999 after long negotiations between Germany and Russia. Today, Rososhka holds the remains of more than 50,000 German soldiers. Some were identified through dog tags, others through dental records, but many remain nameless. A small stone pavilion at the center of the site lists thousands of names still being matched through DNA projects. Every year on February 2nd, the date of the German surrender, delegations from both nations gather at Rososhka. Flowers are laid, flags are lowered. Silence falls across the wind-blown fields. Even in peace, Stalingrad has not gone quiet. The city, renamed Volgograd, has become a living museum. Historical tourism has grown sharply in the past 2 decades, with nearly 600,000 visitors each year, most of them Russian, but many from Germany, Poland, and beyond. Local authorities have built interpretation centers that guide people through the history of the battle. Some exhibits use augmented reality, allowing visitors to overlay wartime images on present-day landscapes. You can stand in a rebuilt trench and, through a headset, see what the street looked like in 1943. Rubble, smoke, and silence broken by gunfire. These experiences bring visitors closer, not just to facts, but to feelings. One of the most meaningful projects to come out of this cultural exchange is called Memory Dialogues. Launched in 2015 by Marina Sorokina, a Russian historian whose grandfather fought at Stalingrad, and Ernst Weber, the grandson of a German soldier declared missing in action, the project creates space for descendants from both sides to meet, share stories, and even exchange recovered personal objects. They've held workshops where Russian and German students sit together, examining letters, photos, and artifacts dug up by archaeologists. Many participants discover that their grandparents once stood on opposite sides of the same field. And yet, the room fills not with tension, but with curiosity and empathy. In the words of archaeologist Sergei Karapetyan, who has worked at multiple battlefield excavation sites around Volgograd, these bones still speak. His team has uncovered rusted helmets with bullet holes, German belt buckles with mottos still readable, and Soviet canteens dented by shrapnel. They find bodies curled together in shell holes, sometimes with medical bandages still on. Each discovery is handled with care. The remains are documented, stored, and whenever possible, identified. But beyond the science is something more personal, a feeling that the land still breathes with memory. Stalingrad isn't just a place you read about. It's a city where history still breathes through the soil. Every step walks over the bones of those who never made it home. Their silence speaks louder than any anthem, reminding us that this wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about what was lost, and how easily it could be lost again.